My brother forced a DNA test at the will reading to prove I didn't deserve a cent. When the lawyer opened the envelope, he didn't look at me. He turned to my stepmother, asked one quiet question, and 30 years of lies collapsed in 60 seconds. The lawyer didn't even glance in my direction. Martin Reeves, 28 years of estate law, the kind of attorney who wears the same navy suit every Friday because he stopped caring what people thought of him decades ago, picked up the envelope, slid it with a letter opener, and unfolded the results in one practiced motion. My brother Garrett was already smiling, leaning back in his chair with the loose, easy confidence of a man who has never once in his life doubted that the world was arranged in his favor. He'd spent the last 4 days telling anyone who would listen that this moment was a formality, that I'd be exposed, that everyone in that conference room was about to watch me get exactly what I deserved. Martin read the first result. My name. Confirmed biological match. 99.99%. The smile didn't disappear from Garrett's face. Not yet. Then Martin read the second. He set the paper down, and he looked at my stepmother, Diane, not at Garrett. Not at the cousins who'd been whispering about me since I walked through the door, at Diane. And he asked her one question. Ms. Coldwell, would you like to address this privately or here? The room went so quiet, I could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Garrett's smile fell off his face like something had cut the strings holding it up. And I understood in that exact moment that the person who had spent 30 years making me feel like I didn't belong in my own family had done the same thing to her own son. My name is Connor Ashworth. I'm 38 years old. I run a structural engineering firm in Denver, Colorado. 12 employees, mid-sized projects, the kind of work where if you get the math wrong, buildings fall down. I mention that because it explains something about how I think. I trust what I can measure. I trust load-bearing evidence. I don't trust feelings, impressions, or a stepmother's warm smile at Christmas dinner. My mother died when I was 4, a brain aneurysm in the kitchen of our house in Dayton, Ohio, while she was making coffee on a Sunday morning. My father, Robert Ashworth, was 31 years old and completely unprepared to be a widower with a toddler and a career in commercial real estate. He met Diane 2 years later. She was 33, recently divorced, with a 3-year-old son named Garrett. She was attractive, organized, and very good at performing warmth in front of an audience. My father married her 13 months after their first date. I was 6. Garrett and I grew up in the same house in suburban Dayton, the big colonial on Westerfield Drive with the wraparound porch that always looked better in the Christmas card photo than it felt from the inside. He was never cruel to me in ways I could point to directly. That's the thing about Garrett. He was precise. He operated in the deniable margin. The look held half a second too long. The joke that landed just wrong enough to sting. The way he'd lean over to Diane at dinner and murmur something that made her laugh at exactly the moment I was speaking. I told myself we were just different people. I told myself it was normal stepbrother friction. I left for the University of Colorado at 18 and didn't look back very hard. I called my father every Sunday for 12 years. We talked about sports, about my projects, about the weather in Dayton. He asked good questions and laughed at the right moments, and never once said anything that felt like the full truth of what was happening in that house. The first red flag I noticed was in 2019. I flew home for Thanksgiving, the first time in 3 years. I arrived at 2 p.m. with a bottle of good bourbon and found Garrett already there, parked in my father's study with the door half closed, talking in a low, fast voice about financial accounts, about consolidating assets, about simplifying things while Dad was still sharp enough to make the decisions himself. My father was 64, completely lucid. I stood in the hallway and listened for 45 seconds before Garrett noticed me. He straightened up, changed his tone immediately, called me buddy, and offered me a handshake. I told myself they were just talking about estate planning. Responsible, adult, normal. I was wrong. My father had a stroke in March 2021, mild by some definitions. He retained his speech, his cognition, his ability to walk, but it frightened him badly, and it gave Diane and Garrett exactly the opening they had been positioning for. By June, Diane had moved back into the house. They had been living separately for 2 years at that point, a trial separation my father mentioned to me only once, awkwardly, on a Sunday call. When I asked about it later, he said they had worked things out. His voice had the flat quality of a man reading from a script. By September, Garrett had been added as a co-signer on 2 of my father's accounts. I found this out not from my father, but from his accountant, Dale Fredericks, a practical man who had worked for my father for 11 years and who called me on a Thursday morning with a voice like someone reading me bad weather reports. "I'm not sure how much you know about the recent changes," Dale said carefully. "Tell me what you know," I said. He told me about the co-signing. He told me that Diane had attended the last 2 financial review meetings in my father's place, claiming he was too tired to manage the details himself. He told me that Garrett had asked, twice in writing, about the process for establishing financial power of attorney over an aging parent. My father was 66 years old and had just gone on a fishing trip to Montana. I drove to Dayton the following weekend without telling anyone I was coming. My father and I sat on the wraparound porch for 3 hours. I brought the bourbon. He drank 2 glasses and told me things he'd apparently been waiting years to say. He said he'd been trying to leave Diane since 2018. He said the separation had felt like progress until the stroke, after which she had managed his fear with the precision of a surgeon, appearing when he was most vulnerable, making herself indispensable, ensuring that any conversation about changing the arrangement happened with her present and mediating. He said there were things he needed to tell me about the family that he hadn't known how to say. He looked exhausted, not physically, the deeper kind. "When you come back for Christmas," he said, "we'll sit down properly. I'll have Martin there. I need to do it correctly." He never got to do it correctly. He died of a second massive stroke on November 14th, 2023, in the night, alone in the bedroom while Diane slept in the guest room. I found out through an email from Martin Reeves. The will reading was scheduled for December 4th at Martin's office in downtown Dayton. Glass and steel, 14th floor, conference room with a view of the city that felt almost satirical given what was about to happen inside it. I arrived 15 minutes early and found Garrett already there, again, talking to a man I didn't recognize. I learned later he was a private attorney Garrett had retained 3 weeks after our father's death. His name was Philip Stroud. He billed $650 an hour and had a reputation for contesting estates. Garrett shook my hand warmly, told me I looked good, asked about Denver. Diane sat at the far end of the table, dressed entirely in black, her eyes moving between me and Martin with the careful watchfulness of a woman calculating distances. Cousins, aunts, an uncle I hadn't seen in 15 years. They populated the chairs along the walls. Most of them avoided my eyes. A few nodded the way people nod at someone they've already decided something about. I heard the word estranged used twice before Martin even opened his briefcase. I had barely sat down before Garrett cleared his throat. "Before we get into the will," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who has rehearsed this, "I want to raise something that I think the family deserves to have addressed, directly." He looked at me, nowhere else, just at me. "The will specifies biological children," he said. "I think given the complicated nature of our family structure, it's only fair that we verify that condition applies equally to everyone in this room." Philip Stroud produced a sheet of paper and slid it across the table. A DNA testing proposal, professionally prepared, already notarized. Garrett spread his hands in a gesture of generous reasonableness. "I have nothing to hide," he said. "I just think clarity is important for everyone." The room murmured its approval. I watched faces I'd known since childhood nod along, relieved to have someone else voice what they'd apparently all been thinking. I looked at Diane. Her expression was the problem, because it wasn't confident. It should have been. She had choreographed this perfectly. The timing, the attorney, the notarized document. She had every reason to look like a woman who had already won. Instead, she looked like someone who had just heard a sound she couldn't place. Her fingers were very still on the table in the particular way of someone actively preventing themselves from movement. I said, "Fine, but if the will specifies biological children, let's be thorough. Everyone claiming inheritance takes the test." Philip Stroud started to object. Garrett overrode him immediately. "Of course," Garrett said. "Absolutely fair." He was still smiling. He shouldn't have been. The results would take 5 business days. Martin requested that I remain in Dayton for the duration. I stayed at my father's house, technically mine now, pending the outcome, which felt both appropriate and deeply strange. I slept in my childhood bedroom and tried not to think about everything. On day 2, Rosa Vega knocked on my door. Rosa had been my father's housekeeper for 14 years. She was somewhere in her late 50s, practical and unhurried, with the specific patience of someone who has spent years watching a family from close range and keeping her conclusions to herself. She handed me a small brass key. "Your father left this with Mr. Reeves," she said, "with instructions to give it to you if he passed before he could do so himself." The key was for a storage room on the 3rd floor, a room I had been told my entire childhood held company documents and a faulty electrical panel. I went up that afternoon. The door opened into something I was not prepared for. Every wall was covered with my life, not the highlights, not the LinkedIn version, all of it. Newspaper mentions of projects my firm had completed in Denver, a profile from a Colorado Engineering Journal 2019, photographs taken from a distance, me at a job site in Boulder, me at a conference in Phoenix, me walking out of my office building on a Tuesday morning in a jacket I'd forgotten I owned. He had been watching me for years, from a distance, collecting evidence of a son he couldn't reach. On the desk was a folder. My hands were steadier than they should have been when I opened it. Engineering training. You look at what's there before you react to it. The first document was a DNA test, dated 9 years ago. I read it twice to make sure I understood what I was looking at. Garrett Coldwell. No biological relationship detected with Robert Ashworth. 0. Below that was a medical file. A notation from a Dr. Patricia Huang, a hematologist, explaining that during a routine evaluation in 2015, Robert Ashworth had volunteered as a potential bone marrow donor for Garrett following a minor health scare. Standard procedure had included genetic compatibility screening. The results had been definitive. Garrett was not my father's biological son. Had never been. Could not be. There was a separate file beneath that. Diane's prenuptial agreement, signed in 1989. Divorce decree dated 18 months ago. Finalized and sealed by mutual agreement. My father had quietly, legally ended his marriage to Diane without telling anyone in the family. In the decree, Garrett was listed as Diane's son, not Robert Ashworth. Ashworths. At the bottom of the folder was a letter, my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the architectural precision of a man who had signed property contracts for 40 years, but shaky now, weakened. Connor, I have failed you in the most fundamental way a father can fail a son. I knew Garrett wasn't my biological child 9 years ago. Patricia Huang's office called me on a Thursday morning, and I sat in my car for 2 hours afterward. I wanted to tell you immediately. I wanted to restructure everything correctly. And then I had the first stroke, and Diane was suddenly everywhere, managing everything. And by the time I could navigate around her, I was afraid, not of her, but of what you would think of me for having stayed silent so long. The money I sent you through Martin was real. The Grant Foundation doesn't exist. That was me. The will is my last clear action. Martin has my DNA sample on file. He knows everything. I'm sorry I was never brave enough to just call you and tell you the truth. Come home, son. The letter ended mid-sentence. He died before he could write the last word. I sat in that room for a long time, long enough for the light through the window to change angle twice, long enough for the kind of grief that isn't about loss but about time. All the time I'd spent telling myself everything was probably fine, that I was probably misreading things, that families were just complicated. I was not misreading anything. I gathered the folder, took it downstairs, and locked it in my car. Then I walked back inside and said nothing to anyone for 3 more days. Day 5, 9 a.m., Martin's conference room. I arrived in the gray suit I wear to city council presentations when I need to be taken seriously. I set the folder on the table in front of me. I didn't open it. Garrett came in at 9:07 looking rested and unhurried. Philip Stroud was with him. They took the seats directly across from Martin's desk, which put them across from me. Diane sat at the end of the table again, in black again. Her eyes went immediately to the folder in front of me and stayed there for 2 seconds too long. Martin began with the legal framework. His voice was the same as always, measured, undramatic, the voice of a man who had done this exact thing hundreds of times and understood that the document did the work. He read the relevant clause, estate to be distributed solely to biological children of Robert James Ashworth. DNA verification required. Any party refusing forfeits claim. Preserved DNA sample on file with Martin Reeves, Esquire, for comparison. I watched Diane. Preserved DNA sample on file. Those 5 words. She had not known about that. I could see it in the half-second recalculation behind her eyes, the moment she understood that the plan she'd built was constructed on a foundation that had already been removed. Martin picked up the envelope. The room went silent in the way rooms go silent when everyone simultaneously stops pretending they're relaxed. He slid it open, unfolded the paper. Read, Connor Ashworth, confirmed biological match to Robert James Ashworth, 99.99%. I exhaled. Garrett's lawyer leaned back slightly. Garrett didn't move. Martin set the paper down. He looked up, not at Garrett, at Diane. Ms. Coldwell, he said, would you like to address the second result privately or here? 3 seconds. I counted them. Garrett's head turned toward his mother. What does that mean? He said. His voice had a quality I had never heard from him before. The precision was gone from it. It sounded young. Martin read the second result with the same flat, measured voice. Garrett Coldwell. No biological relationship detected with Robert James Ashworth. Gone. Just like that. The name he'd spent 35 years assuming belonged to him. The inheritance he'd spent 3 years positioning for. The identity he'd built his entire adult sense of entitlement around. Gone. Garrett was on his feet. His chair hit the wall. That is a lab error, he said. That is an obvious lab error. Philip, tell them. Philip Stroud had gone very still. He was a $650 an hour attorney, which meant he was good enough to understand immediately what he was sitting in the middle of. He said nothing. Garrett turned to Diane. Mom, his voice cracked on the word. Tell them they're wrong. Diane did not look at her son. She was looking at her hands, which were flat and motionless on the table, the most controlled thing left in the room. Was this always the plan? Garrett asked her. His voice had dropped to something quiet and jagged. Using Dad's name this whole time. Garrett, did you know when you married him? Silence. Not the strategic kind, the real kind. I opened the folder and laid the 9-year-old DNA test on the table. He already knew, I said. Bone marrow testing in 2015. Patricia Huang, MD, hematology. He found out when they told him he wasn't a genetic match for a potential transplant. I looked at Garrett, not with satisfaction. I want to be precise about that. Not with any version of triumph. With something that might in a few years become a kind of pity. He knew for 9 years, I said. He never told anyone. He kept it quiet because he didn't want to do this to you in public. Garrett's face did something complicated. The arrogance and the fear and the genuine shock moving across it in layers, like weather. He stayed, Garrett said. Not a question, not quite a statement. He stayed, I said. Philip Stroud leaned over to Garrett and said something very quietly. Garrett's head dropped. He sat back down, slowly, like someone whose legs had stopped trusting the floor. Martin cleared his throat. Per the explicit terms of the will, he said, which requires biological relationship for inheritance claims, and given the preserved DNA sample provided by Mr. Ashworth prior to his passing, the estate passes in full to Connor James Ashworth. He paused. Additionally, he said, looking at Diane now, I have been instructed to deliver a separate document to Ms. Coldwell. He slid a single sheet across across the table. Diane picked it up. "Read it." Set it back down. Her face did not change, but something behind her eyes went out, the way a light goes out in a window when someone in the room decides to stop being home. It was the divorce decree. In case she'd somehow hoped it wasn't real, Philip Stroud packed his briefcase. He shook my hand briefly, said nothing meaningful, and left. His job had become legally irrelevant in the previous 12 minutes. The cousins, the aunts, the uncle, they filed out in near silence. A few of them met my eyes. Most didn't. These were the same people who had spent 4 days in the hallways of my father's house murmuring about how I'd never really been close to Robert, how I'd always kept my distance, how it was interesting I'd shown up now. They had nothing to say to me. I didn't require them to. Garrett found me in the parking garage 20 minutes later. He had his jacket off, his tie loosened, the whole performed architecture of his confidence stripped down to the person underneath it, who turned out to be someone I'd never actually met. "I didn't know," he said. "I believe you," I said. "She told me my whole life that he stopped, started again. "She told me I was his. She made me believe that you were the question mark, that you were the one who didn't really fit. I know. I spent 30 years treating you like, I know that too." He looked at me for a long moment, a man trying to locate himself in a landscape that had just changed its entire geography. "What do I do?" he asked. "That's not a question I can answer for you," I said. "It wasn't my question to carry, and it's not my answer to give." I unlocked my car. "For what it's worth," I said, "my father kept paying for your car insurance until you were 25, paid for your first semester of grad school, wrote you a reference letter for your first job." I looked at him over the roof of the car. "He knew for 9 years. He paid for your life for 9 of those years. That's the kind of person he was." I got in and drove away. The consequences arrived without me having to push them. Martin walked me through Diane's situation in our first full legal meeting, 2 weeks after the will reading. The prenuptial agreement she had signed in 1989 made no provision for her in the event the marriage ended for any reason. She had signed it confidently, certain she would never need to worry about such things. The divorce, finalized 18 months before my father's death, was legally complete. She received nothing. The embezzlement was a separate matter. Dale Fredericks, my father's accountant, provided Martin with 11 years of records showing systematic transfers from household and business accounts into a private account registered to a shell company. The amounts were not small. Martin referred the matter to a forensic accountant named James Whitfield, CPA, CFE, who had done this kind of work for 30 years and presented his findings with the precise boredom of a man who has seen it all. The total was $340,000. Martin gave Diane 48 hours to provide a formal accounting before he referred the matter to the Dayton Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. She provided a partial accounting and a cashier's check for $120,000. The rest, she claimed, she couldn't locate. I did not pursue it further, not because I forgave her, but because my father's letter had been clear on the point of not wanting a public trial, and because spending 2 years in civil court with Diane Coldwell was not what I intended to do with the rest of my life. She moved to Florida. I heard through Rosa that she was living with her sister in a condo outside Tampa, that the old Dayton social circle had contracted sharply around her, that the charity board memberships had quietly not been renewed. The woman who had spent 30 years at the center of a manufactured reality had walked out of the frame. Garrett moved to Portland, changed his professional name to Garrett Cole, his mother's maiden name, started over from essentially nothing, which at 35 is its own particular kind of wilderness. I got one email from him 4 months after the will reading. "I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just wanted to say that I'm in therapy for the first time in my life, and the picture I've been building of what actually happened it's not something I can process quickly. I don't know who I am without the version of myself I was told to be. That's going to take a while. I don't expect forgiveness for how I treated you. I just wanted to acknowledge it existed. I read it twice. I didn't write back. Not because I never would, because some distances need time before they become crossable. I sold the Colonial on Westerfield Drive. I couldn't live in it. Every room held the specific weight of a childhood spent being told I was the unlikely one, the less certain one, the stepson-shaped question. And besides, the house wasn't the inheritance that mattered. What mattered was a small piece of land my father had purchased 12 years ago on the western slope of Colorado, registered quietly under Martin's name. 40 acres outside a small town where the mountains came down to meet a river, and the sky at night had no competition from city lights. My father had never mentioned it to me. I drove out there the week after the legal proceedings closed, in February, in snow. I stood in the middle of those 40 acres in the cold and understood immediately why he had bought it. Because it was the kind of land that didn't ask anything of you. I've been building a house on it for 6 months now. I do some of the work myself on weekends, structural framing mostly, which is what I know. When I pour a foundation, I know it will hold. The engineering firm in Denver runs well without me on Fridays. I've hired 3 additional engineers this year. One of them is 24 and reminds me, faintly, of who I was at 24, certain that the job was everything, not yet understanding that the job is just the thing you do while your life is happening around it. I have a photo on my desk in Denver. It's not a professional photograph. It's a snapshot from 1989. My father at 32, holding me at 18 months old in the backyard of a house I don't remember living sitting in, both of us squinting into the sun. His expression is uncomplicated in a way his face rarely was in any photo I saw later. Just a man who loved his kid, that's all. I established a foundation in January, the Robert Ashworth Fund. Its focus is specific, funding legal representation for adult children in contested estate cases where they can't afford a Martin Reeves. Because the system I moved through had money behind it, my money eventually. But most people facing what I faced have nothing but the truth on their side, and the truth alone is not always enough. The foundation's first grant went to a woman in Cincinnati who had been contesting her father's will for 3 years, alone, without counsel. Her case settled 2 weeks after she got legal representation. I don't know if my father would have predicted I'd do that with the money, but I think he'd have understood why. Rosa called me last month. She said the old house had sold to a young family from Columbus, 2 parents, 3 kids, a dog. She said they'd repainted the porch a different color and put a basketball hoop in the driveway. I told her that sounded exactly right. I'm sitting on the framed floor of the house I'm building right now, looking out at the mountains in the early evening. The snow on the peaks is catching the last of the sun and turning a color that doesn't have an exact name. My father's letter is in my jacket pocket, the shaky handwriting one, folded into thirds. I've carried it since December. I take it out sometimes and read the last few lines. "Come home, son." He wrote that knowing he might not be there when I arrived. He wrote it anyway, in a hand weakened by illness, because it was the truest thing he had left to say. I'm building the home he meant. Not in Ohio, not in Denver, here on his 40 acres, in the shadow of mountains that were here long before any of us arrived, with our secrets and our failures and our difficult love. The foundation pours next week. I measured it 3 times. It will hold.